Welcome to a very special episode of Creative Dynamos. This evening, I have with me several, I'll call them panelists in this case, and we are going to talk about fantasy. So, I've been wanting to do this kind of episode for probably about a month or 6 weeks, and we had to reschedule our last attempt because my body wasn't cooperating. But I'm glad everybody could come on. Why don't we, starting from left to right in my view, introduce yourselves, give me a little bit about yourself, and what's your favorite fantasy IP? We'll start with David.
All right. Lovely introductions. So I'm David. I am one half of the Mikel Melwassul writing squadron, most famously, right, for Paragon Exordium, our first book in our fantasy series. I am currently studying for a master's degree. I got out of the Army fairly recently, so I'm soaking up all that nice government money to do some GI Bill work and then see writing. So what we're working on all kinds of stuff. I'll let Mick get into all that. I am personally working on a novella set in our world that's like Southern Gothic themed. So that's where I'm working at right now. And favorite fantasy IP, well, just finished watching Night of the Seven Kingdoms on HBO. If you're a Game of Thrones person, I think it was very well done and very grounded. And so when you get to look at the Song of Ice and Fire universe from like a very low level, like personal situation instead of just people in a room drinking wine talking about like big battles, like it actually can bring that world to light, like a lot to life. So I'm right now currently we're going with the Song of Ice.
That's me. I'm Michael. I'm the other half of the Mikel Melwassul brand. Dave is the co-author. We used to share pen name. Paragon Exordium. I am a guest checking out all our stuff. So right now we've got a sequel coming out, Paragon Attrition. We got an audiobook with 13 different narrators for our short story collection, hopefully coming out next week, Paragon Apocrypha.
Oh,
And then the week after that, we have our special edition Kickstarter we're launching on Kickstarter, hopefully to fund a special edition of Paragon Exordium, which will then hopefully fund our audiobook for book 2. So lots of things happening in our sphere. My favorite fantasy
Glad I let him do
currently, my favorite fantasy IP currently, I think, is One Piece, and it fluctuates basically on the daily because most of what I engage with and enjoy is fantasy, so it's constantly in flux. But we're going with One Piece today because I don't think you'll see it as the favorite of a lot of epic fantasy authors, even though it does qualify as an epic fantasy despite being a manga.
Absolutely.
Modern Odyssey.
I'm Caroline Ailanthus. I'm the only Caroline Ailanthus in the world, so I like to include my last name because it makes a great search term. And I am now working on book 2 of what has become a fantasy trilogy. When I started, it was going to be a single book, and then I had to divide it in half, and then I had to divide it again. So now it's a trilogy, and I think we're going to keep it with this. My favorite IP, I can't really pick one, but I'm going to pick one anyway because you asked. I'm going to pick Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, because what I'm writing now is in some ways a response to Lord of the Rings. It does the things that I like about Lord of the Rings, fully immersive world building, big scope, interesting characters, they're elves. But it doesn't do the things that I find irritating or less interesting. There's no one single big bad, and if there was, you couldn't get rid of him by disposal of magical jewelry. It's not that easy. It's not I mean, Frodo and Sam wouldn't say it was easy, but it's not that simple. I want my characters to be people who spend really a lot of time not knowing what the heck they're doing, not knowing whether it's going to work. And then after they've done it, they don't know whether it did work. Because that's life. And I want fantasy that when you read it, you think, okay, they did it, so I can do it too. And that doesn't work if they're doing something that doesn't work in our world. So it's fantasy, made up world, all that, but they have the same kinds of problems we do. And that's important to me. Also, there's a whole lot of natural history in there because I'm a geek. And there's a whole lot of, I took a lot of real history and collaged it together because I'm a geek, as I said. So
Yes.
that's what I'm
Uh,
doing.
Jay.
Random Fox POV.
Oh, Rand.
Right.
Yeah.
The Tolkien
Yeah,
reference is a random Fox POV in the Fellowship of the Ring for like 3 paragraphs that goes on way too long and never has any follow up. So it's like all the things you hear about Tolkien. So no Fox POV is what I'm hearing.
No, I
But
don't
worse
remember
head
that. I do
Some
have
people do. It's a
50
rare
pages
little.
of Hobbit history? That'd be good too, right?
I do have I have 3 protagonists, and one of them, the term for how she thinks is probably ADHD autistic. And to give a flavor of that, when it's her point of view, there's no narrative connective tissue. It's just like a couple of paragraphs, boom, and then another couple of paragraphs, boom, and then a listicle because she felt like it.
Also, Jay.
So I'm Jay Requard. I'm an author of epic fantasy, sword and sorcery, and urban fantasy. My last release was Pear Tree, a transcendental fantasy, which was an ebook and audiobook that I put out on Bandcamp that's doing pretty well. My next release is going to be the Timeless Ranger series, which is a 3-book series starting in Sword and Sorcery Elven Ranger. I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm celebrating the 1-year anniversary of my first urban fantasy release, The Driver of Serpents, which came out actually on the 13th. It wasn't a Friday, but it came out on the 13th of last year. And Scott's read it, and a lot of people have read it, and it's done pretty well. So I'm pretty proud of that, and really happy to be here. And my favorite fantasy IP, I mean, so many have been mentioned that are really great. I'm a huge fan of R.A. Salvatore's The Legend of Drizzt. I think that if I have a lifelong fandom that has continued since my teenage years to now, it's probably Bob Salvatore and his series with the Dark Elven Ranger. So there's an obvious influence on my next release.
Awesome. As host, I will take my prerogative to give a couple of my favorites rather than just one, all of which are pertinent to our discussion this evening. Star Wars and Shadowrun and the Chronicles of Narnia. I like Star Wars more as I like to think Star Wars more as a fantasy, which I don't think is really that controversial. Shadowrun is cyberpunk plus magic. And I was going to pick Tolkien, but having been chosen, certainly C.S. Lewis is a really close second. And I love the religious themes that he deals with in his fantasy. So, with all of that out of the way, fantasy is still an extremely relevant genre. And I'm curious as we progress into a more technological age, and we're facing things like AI and cyber threats and stuff like that. Part of me thinks that that's part of the reason why, because fantasy offers more escapism than science fiction does. So I open to the panel. Why do you think fantasy? Do you agree? Do you think there are other reasons why fantasy is still so relevant? And I'll open it to the floor.
So I'll take a shot if anyone doesn't mind. I'll go.
Ooh.
So I not only think fantasy is incredibly important in today's cultural setting. I think after romance, it's almost paramount to today's entertainment, even more so than sci-fi. I mean, if you look at kind of the big sci-fi shows that have come out recently, there's a huge fantasy element to them versus kind of a hard technological kind of examination of what technology does and how it interacts with society. That's not really the stories we're getting. They are a lot more like Star Wars. They're a lot more like Westworld. They are kind of built on a lot more fantasy motifs. And even Dune. Dune is more built on epic storytelling than it is, the movie at least, is more built on epic storytelling and scenery than it is, we're going to explore the technology that Frank Herbert was talking about, and he does explore in those books. I think AI and its kind of introduction to just focusing on the genre of fantasy at the moment and the publishing schema as it works right now, it's obviously going to be weird. It's obviously going to feel very weird because people, no matter what we think and no matter how purist we want to be about AI tools, people are going to be using them. And they're going to be using them whether they like them or not because they're being integrated in so much of the software we just kind of use in the industry, period. I think it's one of those things where we're kind of stuck with it now. That doesn't mean we have to give ourselves wholly to it. But, I think being here in New York, and I'm actually working for a publisher right now, it's definitely being used on the editorial side of things. It's definitely being used in proofreading. If you look at Pan Macmillan, they're definitely using it for their cover art. So I think it's one of those things where, like, when it comes to fantasy and the creation of it, but also the economy of it, fantasy is definitely popular. David mentioned Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Giant blowaway success that no one ever it's having a huge cultural moment right now, and I think and it's not even really a fantasy. Like I've seen the entire thing. There's not a lot of magic in it, like barely any. And I think that's an interesting thing too, that we're now having like pseudo history, kind of like Outlander and Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, kind of come in and be considered fantasy as well. So the umbrella of what the term is expanding, while it's also meeting this new technology. And, Michael mentioned One Piece. Definitely a giant epic fantasy. And arguably, if you look at the numbers now, the most successful epic fantasy of all time, if you consider manga to book sales, which we definitely should. They're on the bookshelf. They are book sales. Far and away.
Thing real quick.
Yes, absolutely.
I think there's a correlation between the popularity of Knight of Seven Kingdoms and One Piece and fantasy right now as it grows beyond the fantasy classical magical elements. It's the fantasy of a knight, a true knight and a true hero, because over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, it has been an overindulgence and an just a constant darkening of your heroes, constant morally gray characters, making the heroic characters more complex. And I think people really, really, really are hungry for heroes that embody light and embody true heroism and go beyond what we perceive as possible as humans today and are that figurehead. And I think that's why A Knight of Seven Kingdoms has gotten such popularity, because it's got a character that's just a true, as you'd classically defined it, knight. Similarly with One Piece, you've got Luffy, who is a character that is just hope. That's his character, all like in a word, he is hope incarnated.
Yes. And I think that one thing that fantasy is really durable to is the cultural sway and movement, because like Mikel just kind of highlighted, I was on a panel a few nights ago for Lord of the Rings, and we were talking about what's going to happen to Lord of the Rings in the future now that, it's being held in different media hands, and it's no longer just Christopher Tolkien deciding what the editing looks like. I think one thing that fantasy has is this durability, specifically because of hope and what hope can mean to so many different people. And I think one thing that we're seeing now is kind of, this morning I saw this kind of like spread of conversation about noble dark and noble bright as these kind of new genres. And we're having this weird pendulum swing where, as Mikel noticed, and I'll end it here, we went through 10 to 15 years of grimdark. We're not leaving necessarily grimdark behind, but we definitely want to swing back to having, feeling like we have characters that are good, stable human beings that have real moral and ethical grounding to them versus what we've had recently. And I think that speaks to, again, fantasy's durability, because it's all going to be fantasy and it's all going to stick around.
It's funny you mentioned that pendulum swing.
It's
that's kind of one of our goals.
It's funny Mick says that, because in case he has forgotten, one of our protagonists is a grimdark anti-hero jerk who's not very heroic at all. So as a person who edits you, I have to let you know that we fall in that former category as far as where our characters are at.
Right. Well, we're setting up though for a pendulum swing toward hope in the future. I'm where your brain's at. You go ahead. I'm sorry.
So like to Jay's, I think what you said definitely makes a lot of sense to me. And I think the cultural, like, I don't. First of all, to answer Scott's question, no, it's not going away, right? And it's changing, right? It evolves as generations move on, and as new people come into the what comes into the zeitgeist, or a new like manga becoming popular in the United States, right? Didn't start that way. Now it's extremely popular. So as more ways of telling stories continue to be added, right? Things will morph and shift, but they won't go away. And something you brought about Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which is true for, I think, fantasy and science fiction in general, is as long as there is turbulence in people's lives, which there will always be, fantasy and science fiction stories can, yes, provide escapism, you're correct, but they can also help you tackle difficult topics while taking the setting away from your everyday life, right? And what got me thinking for that was like Andor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Andor was like a breakout success, but it deals with some pretty heavy things, right? I mean, no spoilers for Star Wars, but like Mon Mothma gives a very, very passionate speech about authoritarianism, right? And if you close your eyes and squint or whatever, you might be like, huh, weird. But the reason that fantasy and science fiction will go away is because there's always going to be a need to displace yourself from whatever's going on in the world and tell that story safely also. And as long as people are going to have problems, then there's going to be a reason for us to try to find that way out in an event. And any sort of social injustice, any sort of anything, right? There's ways to explore that in a safe way when you're doing fantasy. So I think you were 100% right on that.
Sure. Caroline, what do you think?
I've lost track of the question.
What makes fantasy continue to be relevant and popular in your mind?
I'm not sure. I mentioned being a geek, and part of that is that I tend to be an outsider. I don't naturally become part of groups, even groups of outsiders. I just don't know why other people like things. I like fantasy, and I expect to continue liking fantasy. I'm excited to be writing it now. Part of me wonders why it took me so long to get into it. I don't know why other people like it. I have noticed that different fantasies have different functions. There are fantasy stories, and yes, I include a lot of what's called sci-fi in fantasy because, there's no difference between the Force or Vulcan mind meld or whatever and magic. There just isn't. It's just what kind of structure makes it easier to suspend disbelief for different people. All it is. But there are some fantasy stories that are escapist. I would challenge anybody to, if you think Tolkien if Lord of the Rings is escapist, I would ask, why are you trying to escape into Mordor? That's kind of strange.
Valid question.
There are fantasy stories that are wish fulfillment, and often that's odd. Mad Max, the third one with the woman driving the milk truck, that's wish fulfillment because even though it appears to be this horrible dystopic whatever, you get to imagine being a hero in this like sear post-apocalyptic landscape where the bad guys drive around with their own personal like metal guitarist or whatever. It's just cool if you're into that sort of thing. So that's totally wish fulfillment, even though it's objectively would be horrible to live there. There's fantasy that is about trying out new ideas. There's a fantasy that's there's fantasy that's basically a kind of cultural dreaming. Godzilla does this, which is also fantasy. It is defined broadly. In Japan, I understand that Godzilla is a societal dream about the atomic bomb.
Certainly many of the movies, yeah.
Yeah, and the reason why Japan is dreaming about the atomic bomb is obvious. They need to do that, and we have our own dreams. And so fantasy works in all of these different ways. It depends what the author's trying to do with it. Why do
May I
people
jump
like?
in off of?
Hmm?
May I jump in off of something what Caroline's saying, because I think Caroline's actually zeroing in on something really important in terms of the cultural milieu of what we may consider fantasy. I'm going to say something very controversial, but I think that it actually applies to our conversation. I think the most popular fantasy in America right now is Yellowstone. It's a Western, but it tells the story of this kind of America that doesn't exist, where these people have legal powers to get away with basically murder. That's what the train station is. They're all kind of superheroes in themselves. I mean, one of the sons is former special forces. One of the main characters is the cowboy of cowboys. His wife, who is the farmer's daughter, is literally a badass lawyer from the city who went and got a finance degree. So, of course, she walks in both worlds. Like, if you just look at the formulation of the story itself, it works on a lot of fantasy tropes. And I think a lot of the fantasy tropes that, like, we saw in epic fantasy, sci-fi, sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy, romantasy, all of those things, I think a lot of that storytelling has been taken and used now in westerns, horrors, stuff like that. And there's a real kind of fantastical element now in how we portray everything, in a sense. I mean, Game of Thrones was this beautiful thing that when it first shows up on HBO, it blows us away visually. But now, if you look at all these other shows, they're all these visual masterpieces. And it's kind of expected that high-level cinematography that we first see in Lord of the Rings, in Game of Thrones, is kind of the norm for everything else now. So, I think what Caroline is saying, in terms of the delivery of how stories are told and, wish fulfillment, everyone has a particular fantasy. Some of us want to be noir detectives. Some of us want to slay the dragon. Some of us want to rain cattle over Montana. Like, it's all wish fulfillment in a way. And I think she's speaking to something that I think really is true, especially in, like, American storytelling and American media today.
It's funny that you bring up Yellowstone, because I recently posted on social media that Landman is what you would get if George R.R. Martin wrote Dallas.
I hate that title so
I
much.
I think
You
that
too.
we are
The
using
worst.
a super broad definition, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
Because I think in discussions like this, you do have to kind of define your terms. But it hits on another question that we kind of hit back and forth in email, which was, why does fantasy play so well with other genres?
Mm.
And at what point does fantasy stop being fantasy and start being something else? So what do you guys think about why does fantasy play so well with other genres? And at what point does it lose its identity and become something else entirely?
At what point does
Well-
fantasy just become fiction?
Yeah, I think what I would say is, like you were mentioning, like all the different genres that we have, right? Western, sci-fi, right? It's all just a vehicle to tell a good story, like an IP that's as large as Star Wars, right? You can tell any story you want in Star Wars. It doesn't have to be, right, Yoda and whatever, baby Yoda. And fantasy can be the same thing. You can tell a love story. You can tell an epic, political intrigue story. You can tell, right? And it's sort of, it is the fantasy, like whatever you trap it with, like, does that make it fantasy, or does the story itself make it like this, what is the genre of it? Is it just, this is, okay, we're setting a good story with these elements, or not? Because that, like you said, like Westworld, that's sort of that'd be like a mix, right? It's like a Western-ish, but also it's got all these other elements. You talk about like something like Star Trek, right? The holodeck is like a portal fantasy every scene, right? Like it's a
100%.
whole, they're all just all these, elements that you're throwing in. You're just telling a story with different sort of, trapping on top of it, I guess, that if that kind of makes sense. And I think you're right, Jay. The last thing I'll say is that we are living in this like great time for fantasy and science fiction, everything. At least when I was younger, I remember if you wanted to see stuff like Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5, right? Other kind of, you have to go to the Sci-Fi Channel at 3 a.m, right? And now it's everything's supposed to look like Game of Thrones, right? Like it being the sensation that it is tells me that we're alive. So
I will take host priority and say that as far as this podcast is concerned, all Star Wars moving forward should include Grogu.
okay, noted.
That's
Noted.
that's the official stance of Creative Dynamos.
I don't know
He's
if
the
Mikel
next
Melwassul brand signs off on that.
Yeah, you don't
Mandalorian
have to
Grogu
agree.
next year, right? Yeah. Okay.
I'm a Star Wars apostate. You don't want to hear what I like.
That's a
for
whole
exa-
different episode.
example- Well, like for example, Star Wars, for example, now
Mhm.
really is a fantasy. You have the Dathomir Force Witches, you have academies, like
Uh-huh.
you have all the things in Star Wars now that if you just turned it to the Force and said magic, like Caroline said earlier, if you just turned it and you said magic and Force Lightning was just a spell that you had to learn in your head, like, you know, it's so close now that it's really hard to differentiate between them sometimes.
Right.
Scott, can you repeat the question again? Because like
Sure.
All the fantasy authors are
and
giving
let me-
long-winded answers.
yeah,
Let me also say that Star Wars was fantasy from day one.
yes,
Because you had knights and magical swords
Yeah.
and force and everything else. Why does fantasy play so well with other genres, and at what
Oh.
point does it start to lose its identity?
It's malleable.
well, I think it's malleable. I think also fantasy at its core is mythology. Like that's where it comes from. It's the continuation of us telling mythological stories. And I think as long as we have mythology and this idea that we have inherited our identities or our stories, whether it's individual or communal or national or whatever, as long as we have this idea that our stories came from someplace, I think we're always also going to have fantasy.
Mhm.
And it's just always going to work well with other genres because, again, myths offer really easy motifs to build stories off of, especially if you're a new writer. Like, you know, how many stories have we seen that are Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet? How many stories have we seen that are a retelling of Lord of the Rings or someone's take on it? Like, we've seen so many different iterations of things now that, you know, I think it's just one of those things where it mixes well together. Where I think it was David who says when fantasy becomes fiction, I think the place where fantasy stops being fantasy and becomes fiction and becomes something else is when the logic behind it kind of pushes away from the suspension of disbelief, and you actually need to have a reasonable answer for it, like murder mysteries. A lot of murder mysteries aren't fantasy, and if they're set in the modern day, like, you need forensics and you need evidence. It's not like you can just the criminal isn't just going to magically walk into the precinct because they heard a song and now they're guilty about something. Like, you know, there's
Right, but something like Dresden Files.
yes,
Right.
Well,
Right.
like
it's yeah.
There's the
Right.
malleability coming back around.
exactly. Well, I think the moment the story becomes unmalleable to a certain extent, that's
Mhm.
when it becomes the thing that it is. Because again, fantasy allows you to essentially have Play-Doh.
Mhm.
I mean, I think once the Play-Doh dries, it is what it is. That's a really bad analogy, but we're gonna go with it.
Yeah, I think that works. I think that works.
Lion King best hand also, no question.
Yes, far and away.
While we're out here giving hot takes, I think that's a good one. Caroline, what do you think?
I was just about to say that it was just said, actually, that what makes something a fantasy is less what tropes it does or what the specific thing that you're imagining is. It's to what extent does it break the rules of normal reality? Most fiction does this to some extent, but in most fiction, it's a mistake. It's a plot hole. It's a problem. You have to take it with a grain of salt. But in fantasy going in, you're just playing on a different set of rules than normal. Like mine doesn't have fantasy magic, but it does have a world that doesn't actually exist. it has all these, animals and plants and people. Going in it, you have to be like, okay, what are the rules of this game? What's she actually doing here? And that changes who's going to be interested in reading it. That changes how you write it, because you have to get the reader up to speed on what the rules are and how are you going to do that. So that makes it distinct as a creative form. And then within that, there's just all this variation. What kinds of rules are you following? What tropes are you using? And it varies. Why it plays well with other genres, it's just compatible. Westerns are by nature set in something at least recognizably similar to a particular time, historical moment. And as one of my friends, Arlo Z. Graves did, you can write a Western in which there are, trains and guns coming alive and talking to people, and it's still a Western. And it's also fantasy, and romance is defined as it centers a romantic relationship, and there's got to be a happily ever after, and there's probably going to be some sex and so forth. And you can do that and have at least one of the lovers be a fairy, and the kind with wings and antenna and whatnot. It's just compatible. That most other, maybe even all other genres, you can follow the rules of that genre and still take leave of ordinary reality. Whereas
fantasy,
you can't. Mm-hmm.
Does fantasy expand beyond genre to setting?
What do you mean?
So does it take a status above just genre? If you can put any genre in fantasy, does that elevate fantasy to a level that's beyond just genre, because it can be any genre, so therefore it becomes setting? And if that's the case, what is the defining element, right? So culturally, I would argue that the defining element of fantasy is the presence of magic. And if you don't have magic, people who are expecting it to be fantasy, you are removing the element of it that people create and use to define the setting as fantasy.
Yeah,
But what about magical realism?
Keyword in that, magical realism.
And then what about things like mine? And this is where me
Right,
being an
that's the
outsider
question.
comes. Because it has what I like about high fantasy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has what other people like about it.
Right.
I
So
hope
what
so.
elements of your story? Do you have creatures that are mythological in it? Right?
Yes.
What are the elements? Okay, so therein is a sort of magical tie-in. Whether or not they're magical in your world, they have a magical backdrop, societally speaking, right? So you can have a fantasy story without magic, but if the rules and the existence of the world is intrinsically tied to a societal concept of magic, then it's in. I feel like if you remove that element, it ceases to become fantasy. I think that's where the hard line has to be, and then it's just fiction.
But I will say that magic and fantasy can both be defined incredibly loosely.
Yes.
I mean, we've already brought up Star Wars like half a dozen times in this conversation.
Yes.
And the Force isn't technically magic per se, but it functions as magic. It
functions as magic, which is your basis for your definition of Star Wars as fantasy. It's the Force.
Called magic.
Right. But
I don't see any reason why it's not.
Exactly. That's exactly my point.
You have a lot of the same things around magic in the Force that you would have in a fantasy story, acolytes and people learning from guys in long robes with big beards and things of that nature. So I would say I agree. And hoods.
And hoods.
I agree. I agree so far as magic has to be defined somewhat loosely as a supernatural force.
You can use science to explain that force and still be fantasy. My theory that I like to espouse about the difference between science fiction and fantasy is that science fiction has to have a tie to our reality and be an extension of a future prediction of our reality. As soon as you step away from our reality and make it a new reality with any kind of rules or changes to our laws and understanding of physics, it becomes fantasy.
Yeah, even though a lot of popular science fiction is by that definition fantasy, which I totally agree with, by the way. Star Trek, I love Star Trek. Star Trek is not science fiction. It's space fantasy. It just is.
It's
I
a very
think that-
technical space opera.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like I like it when the edges blur though, like in the movie Bright, which is clearly like a
Great film.
Shadowrun movie basically that we never got. Is that strictly speaking fantasy? I mean, it has like fantasy
So
archetypes in it.
you brought up that. You brought up Brightburn.
Oh, not Brightburn, it's Bright.
Oh,
The Will
Bright.
Smith movie.
Oh,
The
Bright,
Will
the Will
Smith
Smith movie.
Yeah.
Do you know what? In some ways, though, I think Bright and Brightburn have a lot of things in common. But yeah, Bright. Okay,
Bad
thank you.
movies.
Say more.
Bad movies, yes, but if you look at them
Now
in
say
terms of
less
like,
because that's
no, I'm kidding. No, I actually like Bright. I like the idea behind Brightburn, but anyway, we're getting off track. When it comes to movies like Bright, I think the issue you have there is that you have studios that have a concept of what fantasy is and think that you can paint it on as an aesthetic without having to do the work of world building, investing the audience in the characters. Like the wonderful thing about Bright, I actually read the comic that they published around it because weirdly, if you look at films like that, or Willow, for example, Willow's a great film. Read the novelization. World's better. And that's not a slight to the film either. But like, if you look at how they presented Bright, it's just there's no explanation to it. There's just orcs, elves, magic, but here's a cop story with Will Smith. And that's the sell of it. There's no sell of like, oh, this is going to be a brand new series that they're going to continue on into other stories. He didn't sign a 3-film deal. It was a shot. It was a shot that they took. And I think, it's painting fantasy on as an aesthetic instead of using fantasy as an actual launching point for storytelling and characterization and actual world building. For example, like the wand in Bright. Spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen this thing. But like, what's the difference between the wand and a nuke or a vial of chemical weapons or a deadly disease that Tom Cruise usually is the one that has to stop from spreading or getting into the terrorist's hands? Like,
Bright takes a hammer, wraps it in a cloak that they name the cloak Allegory,
Yes.
and then beats you over the head with it and leaves no room for
Yes.
subtlety. I
Yes.
have a personal problem with Bright.
it is the official stance of this podcast that Will Smith cannot make a bad movie.
that's
But,
a hard one to say.
I have blinders on. That's all. I mean, that's all.
Wild.
I'm not.
It's a
I will
wild
not
thing to
defend.
say.
I will not defend Bright as a movie, other than to say that I enjoyed it.
There's some cool concepts in it. There really are.
Yes.
But I will say to your analogy of wrapping a cloak around it, and to what Jay was saying, painting fantasy as a veneer over it. Fantasy isn't the only genre to suffer that particular problem. Steampunk has a similar issue where people will just throw some gears into a story and call it steampunk. So, I guess why, so this is a deeper question. Why is using so let me take a step back. So with science fiction, typically, and good science fiction, as somebody said earlier, you are sort of in many cases forecasting, and you're using technology or science as a jumping off point to tell a story. And I think what Jay was saying was with fantasy, ideally a story would take fantasy elements and use them sort of as a jumping off point to launch the story. That's a very fine line. I think. How important is it that you're on the right side of that line as far as as authors who write in this genre? Um, what is your mission if you have one? What is the purpose that you have in writing fantasy? When you sit down to write a fantasy story, what do you keep in front of you to kind of keep in that zone? If that question makes any sense.
I'll let other people go first because I write in 3 different genres, and that's a loaded question.
I'm
That's
distracted
kind of.
about the dog.
This is Liz.
Oh,
hi,
hi,
Liz.
Liz. Oh, you're adorable.
She is.
Yeah.
I decided I needed to pet her, so I scooped her up. Yeah, I have trouble with the edges of genre too. I never tried to write in a genre before at all, and then this time I decided, well, give it a shot. And I understand that genre is all about expectations, but if the thing that I'm going to something expecting and enjoying is not the same as what everybody else is, it's going to my version of it is going to come out differently. And I've been worrying about that. And people who've actually read the first book in this series like it. So I guess I'm doing it right. But a lot of what I'm doing is I'm playing with tropes and I'm playing with conventions. There's no fantasy magic. There is a little bit of ESP and so forth. And the characters believe in magic. They talk about magic. They talk about various supernatural beings. It's not at all clear whether they're right. Just don't be very wrong about this stuff. There's no way to tell. But I want to evoke this. There are these animals. They're pretty clearly the Pleistocene megafauna, but they have fantastical beast names. Because I'm trying to suggest maybe that's what these fantastical beasts are. Maybe they're real. Maybe they're cultural memories of things that our ancestors saw. Maybe the wonder and excitement and all of that about fantasy is actually just a property of the real world, but for some reason we're not seeing it. And how can we get this back? To what extent is real life a lot more fantastical than we let ourselves think it is? So I'm playing with all of that. Does all that count as, am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to call it fantasy? I don't know. It's what I'm doing.
I think you are. You are. And if your audience is happy with it, as you said, you're doing something right. Michael, you look like you were just about to vibrate out of your chair while she was talking. So clearly,
we're finding what she said very familiar.
That's basically our thesis, right?
We like it. Yeah.
Conceptually, the very idea of Paragon Exordium and the Galvorn saga is that there is a collective memory of things forgotten, right? That has been perpetuated through our dreams, and it is a historical memory humanity has of another world that was stolen from us, right? And so the whole concept of our fantasy world is it's modern day, and a spell that stole magic and memory from us breaks the sky and returns that fantasy to our world. And now we have to survive with the reality that elves and orcs and dwarves and all those things were real and they're back, and humanity is on its back foot. Like that's our entire concept. You've just boiled it down.
Like this would be difficult. This would be difficult to assign, right? Like Caroline is saying, the line is difficult, and it's almost like like how the Supreme Court defines like something that's too sensational for TV, like it when you see it, right? Like I forget what ruling it was, where it's like, is it bad enough? Well, you have to tell. When something is slapped together, and when it isn't. Let me give you a couple examples, because like we could have made Paragon Exordium a sci-fi, but since it wouldn't work the same way because of how rooted in you could so it'd be floating cities and stuff. You could have, but it wouldn't work the same way because it wouldn't be naturally in that thing. So like think about the highly successful multi-bazillion-dollar Avatar series, right? You would think, maybe that's science fiction because it's the future and humans go to another planet and there's unobtainium. But is it really? Or is it just it's blue paint of science fiction pasted over Pocahontas? right?
Yeah.
So in that case, it's not it's just there, right? Like, I don't think that that's a science fiction story because it's literally just it's science fiction, right? So that'd be a no. But Scott said something about like steampunk, like people throwing gears and cool hats on people. Something like Immortal Engines, right? Whether you like the movie or don't like the movie, like, seems like kind of like the steampunk-ishness of it is intrinsic, right? The cities are moving because of these colossal machines. Android guy, there's like Shrike or whatever that, like, that would be hard to do. You could do it in another genre, but it feels we can almost immediately tell that something's like made for the setting naturally, and it's not just gears and an airship on the background. But I don't know about what you guys. It's just hard to say where the line is, because like Caroline was talking about, what's fantasy to me, what I write, isn't, it's this new genre, or that, right? You're going to infinitely break things down. You can always have it, but you can never, get away from it. So it's just, I think people can judge and you can tell, but you have to make that call. And that's where the fun can be, on those edges. But
I think for me, and kind of how I was coming at this question, although I love the answers so far, is when I sat down to write my current story that I'm working on, that's my first sort of traditional fantasy, it sprung forth out of my love for Dungeons and Dragons. And in fact, it is based in my homebrew D&D world, which is based on Eastern North Carolina, as far as geography is concerned. But the thing that's very, hopefully, unique is a strong word, interesting about what I'm trying to do is magic is taking a back seat.
Mm-hmm.
Because in this universe, magic has a cyclical nature, and this kind of gets back to what you all were saying. Instead of the real world, fantasy impinging on the real world, this is the real world impinging on fantasy. And the characters are having to solve all of their problems using their brains and skills and not relying on magic. So I've taken away the easy answers of magic. Somebody can't just cast a spell and say, oh, what did this, what was in this room 4 hours ago? Or I'll just do speak with dead, and that person can then tell me who killed them. I've taken away all of the shortcuts that fantasy typically gives the characters, but I've kept what I think is the fantastical elements of all of the fantasy races. And magic does still exist to a degree, but they can't rely on it the way they would if they were in a traditional fantasy novel. So for me, anything that has like the element of the fantastic, the unbelievable, the unprovable, when I sit down to write a story and I include these fantastical elements, whether it's in my Father Ian stories where there are theoretically fae and demon creatures and angels and all of that kind of stuff interacting, but there's no magic per se, or it's my Escher St. Clair series where it's like, it's a gaslamp fantasy, and there are traditional fantasy elements, but it's all very much a police procedural / consulting detective kind of story. So, but the fantastical elements are still there. And I think that for me, when I sit down as a writer and say, okay, I'm going to write fantasy, I think about what are the fantastical elements I'm going to include. And that's what for me sort of defines what genre I'm playing around in. Jay, we've all said our piece. What do you think?
So I will try to keep this as short as possible so it's coherent as possible. I write in 3 different genres. I've published traditionally and independently in 3 different genres now. And, if you're indie and you're publishing indie, you get so much more freedom in terms of what you get to do with genre, with tropes, stuff like that. In traditional publishing, tropes are part of an expectation. Readers who buy traditional books have a certain set of expectations you have to hit. And I think the magical thing going forward for fiction writers, especially since indie is so powerful and popular, but traditional publishing is always going to be here and it's always going to be its own economic engine too, you now have to find a middle ground between those two things. So, that being said, I write sword and sorcery. On a third of my career is about writing sword and sorcery. Sword and sorcery has a lot of tropes and genre requirements, and people in the sword and sorcery community get into huge fights about what sword and sorcery is, because if you don't have something like an outsider, is it a sword and sorcery? If the world's at stake, is it a sword and sorcery? If there's people throwing spells, is it a sword and sorcery? Because there's an argument that like magic and sword and sorcery is not really this kind of like present thing. It's kind of like found in the undead, and it's found in the creatures, and it's found in the aura of things to a certain extent. Now, if you look at epic fantasy, that has like profound magic on its face. A lot of people in traditional published books expect there to be a magical system. Brandon Sanderson is popular for a reason with those readers. They like systemic world building with these huge details and these huge things, where a lot of indie readers, it turns out, kind of want more narrative and story and characters, not just, 3 pages of world building. So I think when it comes to epic, it's trying to balance all those things too, and also having something you're examining. Urban fantasy, which is something that I'm currently writing the follow-up series to the series I released last year. It is a urban romantasy, so it has romantic elements in it. So learning to do that has been interesting. But on the other side, I think if you're an urban fantasy author and you want to write something that doesn't sound like it was written in the 90s, it's a huge challenge now in terms of technology. Like if you have a character in an urban fantasy who lives in the current present day real world, they have a smartphone. And they interact with things like that. The internet is something that they have to deal with. Social media is if you just have angels, and Scott's read one of my books in my series, if you have angels duke it out at LaGuardia and everyone has a smartphone and they can tape it and put it on YouTube, what happens now to the secret of angels, or the secret of demons, or the secret of magic, or the secret of God's existence, or other gods' existence? I think superhero fiction and Marvel kind of also came along and changed urban fantasy a little bit, where I think a lot of superhero fiction crosses the line into it. And I think it's just a different set of circumstances where you have to be careful how you date your stories, because you're also going to date your audiences in a little bit. Like, I have some older readers that just do not understand how my main characters, why they're navigating the internet in all these chapters and they're looking up things on Wikipedia and shit like that. But younger readers understand that because that's what they're doing every day. But if you read, I have a friend who's literally 18 and he's one of my students, and he just read Dresden Files. So David mentioned it earlier. He's like, where are their cell phones? Why aren't they using the internet? Why are they not doing this? Why are they not doing that? So urban's a kind of a weird thing for me, because it's not just having the fantasy and having the creatures and having the characters and world building. You have to also kind of juxtapose it to the modern world, or a sense of the world in a certain time and place. So it's a different challenge.
It's interesting how much technology dates a story, because even in the context of what you're talking about with angels and stuff, right? 10 years ago, it becomes a major problem because, now they record it. Now, if you do it, then you can just excuse it away with AI. And all those smartphone recordings are AI, right? So I think that's an interesting tie-in with fantasy, especially because fantasy goes back so far. Because in the last 100 years is where we've had just this technology becomes so identifiable within the last 100, 150 years. Once you go farther back is where it becomes less and less identifiable in the time stream, which is why it's so intrinsically ties to fantasy, because fantasy really blows up when we look at when writing becomes popularized and becomes accessible, right? And so that's looking back at an older historical time. So fantasy was being developed. Now, I say that, and then there's the Epic of Gilgamesh, which sort of disproves part of my point. But I think you guys would get what I'm getting at with how technological progression is so intrinsically identifiable. And then
also a difference
fantasy.
between a cultural myth and something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where it's we're going to do a novel for consumption, not just
The thing about technology and time is technology has always worked like that. So anytime you have a real world setting in a historical moment, you have to pay attention to. The thing is that if you go further back, your readers are mostly not going to notice. But I was writing this scene this morning, and my setting is fantasy, but with certain, and it's a made-up world, but with certain obvious exceptions. The technology is like late Roman Republic, 1st century BCE. And they also have a telegraph and some other things that wouldn't go there. But that's on purpose. I don't want to do things, anachronistic things by accident. So I was trying to figure out, okay, this character almost gets hurt in a traffic accident. Did Roman carts have brakes? What kind of brakes did they have?
Great
When
question.
did they invent brakes? And there are things like that. When were stirrups invented? Do I want to include stirrups or not? What quality steel were they using then? You look up Roman weaponry, and different styles of weapons and different types of mail were used at different points in Roman history. And how much of that do I want to borrow? And then I'm borrowing a whole bunch of stories from 19th century America. And so then you get it. So I think a lot about those times and those people and how you had this one generation. I think a lot about William Tecumseh Sherman. He is has become a literary hero of mine. And he was born in 1820. Which means that, and then his father died when Sherman was still a child. He didn't have a photograph of his father because when his father was alive, there weren't photographs. The first time he had an opportunity to get on he was a child when they invented the steam locomotives. His first chance to get on a train, he didn't take it because he was freaked out because the technology was weird. And then he grew up and made possible the transatlantic railroad. And that all happened in one generation.
Yeah.
Technological change is not new. It's just that if you set something now, people are going to notice when you get it wrong. That's the difference.
Sure. And you touch on one of the really fun elements.
Research. Yeah, you got to do doing your research. I mean, I nerded out this entire time. Your book is literally unreadable because the card has breaks, 0 out of 10 on Amazon. No, you're right. Anachronisms are like that, and I think Mick's favorite thing is when people have champagne. In fantasy stories, because that's a specific, right, not from that place. Yeah, so
drives me insane.
You make your own world, you make your own rules. Like they better be good as you made it, but get the details. Like, get the real details right. Carolyn's you're all over. You are all over it. I love those raps.
That's one of the funnest parts about writing fantasy is figuring out where you want to draw that line, how far you want to dig into research, and how much stuff you want to decide. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but having elements of that where you've done the research really grounds your world for the reader in a big way that I think is super important. It's just a question of what is your preference and what is your flavor, and that creates your fantasy genre, your fantasy voice.
You touch on something really important,
Scott. But may I add something like Mikel just
said,
kind of off of what Caroline said? Sorry to interrupt.
No.
One of the things, and David also mentioned the research about all these things now. Like, technology also changes how we look at fantasy in terms of how things work. For example, I'm about to finish the 3rd novel in what I'm calling my Project Dragon War trilogy. There's dragons, they're fighting. But if you stop and think about it, like, the way we probably thought about dragons fighting in the Middle Ages, getting on the ground and blowing fire and fighting knights on the ground where a knight can stab them with his lance and everything. Like, that doesn't work in today when we have, like, aerial warfare, and we now know what bombing runs look like. And, you have these dragons with these huge claws that grab onto each other and giant jaws that can bite, cows in half. It turns into this thing of, like, I thought Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, actually did a very good job in terms of integrating kind of what we know of modern aerial warfare into dragon fighting. Like, it really would become this kind of positional thing, and setting people on fire really is this huge strategic advantage that you can have. Like, but I think part and parcel to that is we have so much more access to information than ever before. So making the fantastical look more real is more possible than ever before, because we have the ability to really go in and think about it. Where, if you're Tolkien, you have no idea about how dragons fight other than the Germanic myths that you've been reading and the other Northern European myths that you've been reading. And all of those are, tricking dragons and finding, and funny ways to get into holes so you can stab dragons in the heart with your sword. But there's none of this kind of like Skyrim, I'm going to go fight a dragon face to face. But Skyrim's really important because it kind of showed us the mechanics now of, I think, for a lot of authors, how to do good dragon fights.
Is
Yeah,
a dragon warm enough to be picked up by a surface-to-air missile? Tune in
Great
next
question.
week in Paragon. Never mind. Spoiler.
Do you know what? I wish they had dealt with that in Reign of Fire. Like, someone
Ooh.
had to have had a missile, and like no one ever deals with this in Reign of Fire. I wish they had done with it. And
They
Matt
do.
McConaughey, by the way. Oh wait,
They shoot
I'm
missiles
sorry.
at the dragon in Rain of Fire.
Do they work? I forget.
No,
All
the
I
dragon's too agile.
Okay, all I remember is Matt McConaughey with the beard and the
battle
axe,
axe,
and
yeah.
just getting grabbed out of the air by the dragon,
No
which is a
shirt.
great scene.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no shirt for some reason. I'm gonna go fight a dragon with no shirt on.
I think
Shirt's not
Just-
gonna
I
make
think
a
if you're
difference.
gonna have, I think if you're gonna have Matthew McConaughey in your movie, you have to have him without a shirt at least. One of the things that, to springboard off of what you were saying, Jay, and of what everybody has said so far, which leads into my next question, and then that'll be our final question for the evening. And groundedness is so important in fantasy. Like in the fantasy novel that I'm working on now, I have to think about the anatomy of a halfling, and I have a character reach into his chest cavity to see if his heart is still there, because that's important at that point in the story. So I have to think, okay, how is halfling anatomy different because of their stature and everything else? And in my St. Clair books, like Nikola Tesla plays a major part, and that marriage of technology and magic that happens in one of those stories turns out to be, in my mind, and will be thematic as the series goes forward, because the thing that's great about the late 1800s, to Caroline's earlier point, is so, like, it was a technology boom. So much technology that we take for granted now came into fruition between the period of like 1860 and 1920. We went from horses as the fastest way to get your mail across the country to airplanes in the space of 40 years, 50 years. It's so when you bring this fantasy element into your story, whatever time period it's set during, I think it's very important now more than ever, I think, to Jay's point, to ground your reality in reality. So whether it's the scientific explanations that we get for Caroline's fantasy creatures, or the social media aspect that plays an important role in some of Jay's stories, or the idea that you've got a guy wearing full military kit with an assault rifle and a sword strapped on his back. And why would he use the assault rifle? I mean, why would he use the sword when he has an assault rifle? Well, wait, the sword's magical. What effect does the magical sword have on tank armor? All of these things you have to think about to ground your story in reality, so that you can get away with having dragons and angels and whatever else it may be. So I think the more fantastic you go, the more grounded it is important to be in whatever reality you're placing your story in. And that gets to my final question for the evening, which is sort of the soft science to the hard science that we've been talking about. And that is your worldview and your social mores. How do those impact your writing, influence your writing? writers use their art to say something. We use fantasy and horror and science fiction as a way to make us a little more comfortable and make the reader a little more comfortable when it comes to saying some hard things or some true things or things that we believe and take very seriously. What role does that play in your writing, and how much thought do you put into that when you're creating these fantastical worlds? As Tolkien obviously did when he was writing his great works.
Well, Tolkien's interesting because on one hand, clearly Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the Silmarillion are allegorical to things, clearly to his experience.
He would punch me right in the mouth.
He would punch me in the face.
Exactly.
He would punch me in the face for saying it, but like, Tolkien's one of those people who's like, it's not allegory, but it's like, it sounds like some war trauma here we're dealing with.
This giant war wasn't influeed by my war service at all. Go get out of here. Okay.
Oh, C.S. Lewis, his best friend, countered it and was like, it's going to bleed into whatever you do.
Yes, exactly. And that's a very important point. I think, again, I write in 3 different genres. I think when it comes to sword and sorcery, I really do just try to write a exciting adventure because that's what the publishers usually want, and that's what the readers want, and that's what the editors buy. So, like, I really just try to write a good character going up against a good challenge that involves magic or beasts or whatever, and of course they're going to win. Or sometimes they're going to win, but it's going to be really, really tough. With epic fantasy, I think everyone has a philosophy behind their epic fantasy that they want to talk about and push, even if they don't have a name for it or anything written down. I think we just have our own morals and ethics that we just want to explore sometimes. And I think epic fantasy allows people to do that. Like, kind of getting back to Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, the way they view and feel about the world clearly shines through in those stories. When it comes to urban fantasy, like, and Scott knows this, I write an urban fantasy where Jesus Christ literally comes back. And so
spoilers, I haven't gotten to that point in the story yet.
I mean, it should be but and I had no choice. By the time I got to that 3rd book, it was one of those things where you're writing it. It was like, oh no, I have no choice. He's coming back. So, but that really is kind of the exploration of what happens when modern technology and modern society meet these ancient thoughts and feelings and characters and motifs, and how do we really move forward with it? Like, if you have a world where angels can bang humans or demons can get married and have children, what does it actually mean when you have a world of people having these relationships? I mean, even in the Bible, there are people having relationships with supernatural creatures to some level. And what happens if that happens in the modern day? What does that look like? How do we as society, with YouTube, with the internet, with social media, with all of these things, the destruction of Hollywood, how do we all, deal with these things if they happen? Which is, the big what if question that I think fantasy allows us to explore other things with. We get to ask what if, and then we get to answer it with other things.
What about you, Caroline? What is your purpose in writing these fantasy worlds? What purpose do you bring to it?
There's one level where I wanted to write about a fictionalized William Tecumseh Sherman, and everything else is in service of that. But yeah, I do spend a lot of time thinking about the world and America and what's going on. And on the one hand, I absolutely don't want this story, The Elf, the Dwarf, and the Telegraph, to be, I don't want it to only make sense in this time period. 80 years from now, I don't want people to look back and say, oh, great, now I have to study the 2020s in order to understand what the heck she's writing about. In a way, it's my restless dream. The stuff that's going on in your life, it gets into your dreams, and this imagery helps you express and process what's happening. And that's a lot of what it is for me. Kind of part of what I want it to be for other people. I've had one reviewer complain that there's one character who's just, to use a name that's been in the news a lot lately, that one character is too obviously Donald Trump. He's not. He's based on multiple historical people. Most obviously, most significantly, Julius Caesar. If you haven't studied Caesar, you might not pick that up. So I don't have a moral. I'm not using fiction to advocate a policy proposal. I'm not trying to tell people what to do. I don't know what to do. And I want my book to be accessible to people who don't have the same morals and priorities that I do. I don't want to limit it to people who agree with me. But I also have some stuff on my mind. And I want to talk about that. And I do. So that's
Beautiful.
what I'm doing.
I think I couldn't have said it better myself, for sure. I think just like technology can date you. Like you said, like anachronisms in tech can date your story, or people can do. Same with your worldview, right? Like if you try to stream an episode of Tom and Jerry right now, you might get a warning on the beginning that says, "Hey, this was made in the 40s. It's pretty racist." That doesn't mean you have to take those, into consideration, right? So yeah, you want to be timeless as best that you can, but your opinions and your thoughts that you have now are a product of what's going on in your life and what's going on in the world, and there's no way to escape that, right? I mean, someone in 80 years looking back are going to go, "Wow, things must have been XYZ way in the 20s, because all these people are writing these stories, and they're all seem to have really a lot of anxiety about their health. Gee, I wonder what could have," and then right then
The
they
20s.
get into this whole situation. So yeah, I think you're totally on point with that. I will say, yeah, I don't feel a responsibility to say things. Now, I have taken shots at people. I have taken shots across the bow, and I will continue to try to, take some shots at some people and things that I may or may not like in what I have going on. Mick is laughing because he's probably remembering a few of them, right? Yeah.
One character comes to mind, yeah.
Yeah, maybe. I do have a short story where someone says something nice about a now deceased dictator, and that was found amusing by some individuals. But in any case, yeah, I mean, it's part of, it's part of you. You're going to bleed into there no matter what, whether you deny it or not, right?
Yeah.
It's going to some of that's going to it's going to happen. And yeah, you're totally right to want to have like something that lasts as long as it can, and be as timeless as it can. But time marches on, and at a certain point, someone's going to have to be like, "Ooh, what was happening to?" Right? It might eventually happen. And could we be so lucky that that's happening? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Could any of us be so lucky as to have someone, "Wow, great grandpa, why do you have these?" And
Absolutely.
Michael?
It's interesting to think about this question within the context of my books, because I'm writing them with Dave. And Dave and I agree on a lot, but we also disagree on a lot. And we have, I think, at our core, some fundamentally different views of the world. And so how that bleeds into our story is really fascinating, because it will bleed in regardless of what you're doing. But it's that meeting of minds and multicultural blend. I think it's really fun, because we're not trying to be preachy about anything, but we are both bringing our different perspectives on things and how things work, right? And so that's a really interesting, and I hope that adds a depth to our worlds and our books that others might be missing, and really sticks with people, because I think it creates more ways for people to interpret it. And so what is my goal in writing? That's the question, right? What's kind of your goal or with your worldview? My goal is immortality, right? Ultimately, my goal is immortality, to leave a mark on history that is forever present, or at least present as long as history remains intact, so far as it can, right? But my goal with the story is to write a fun story that embraces the inner child that I had in his imaginings, right? I had the idea for my book when I was 13. I was like, wouldn't it be cool if we had Red Dawn, but with Lord of the Rings characters instead of communists? What would it be like today? And the story has grown out of that little concept into something so much more complex and interesting, but still is rooted in that 13-year-old's brain of, this would be fun. I'd like to fight some elves and orcs in my backyard, you know? So like and the further we get into it and as the story evolves, we're saying more and more, but I do think we are working very hard not to be heavy-handed about it and not get political about it, but get down to the human mind and how the human mind works and get more sociological, individual about it than overbroad political. It's much more about human nature itself.
And very briefly to say, like, character views and author views aren't the same, and people conflate that a lot, and it gets very complicated.
100%.
So like we can make an evil or a racist character and make Mick a racist too. You know, we can put these thoughts in different people's heads and it will come off a certain way. Just saying. You know?
And I hope that people do, like, I hope that the majority of people do realize that, because I am writing a story and have been for probably a year now about the most despicable human being. I hate every second of his existence, but he's fascinating to me because he represents some very hard truths about what it means to be a human being, what it's always meant to be a human being, and what decisions we make and what the ramifications of them are. And I think that what I'm hearing broadly is, and I think this is probably, not to get prescriptive, the best way to write. We are all of us trying to tell good stories, and we are all acknowledging that our own humanity, our own point of view gets in there. And I think that makes for the best stories, because anything else is going to feel sanitized. It's going to feel artificial. And I think by allowing yourself the freedom to bring in your points of view without getting preachy about it, to what Caroline was saying, it's important. I think that fantasy and science fiction for me are largely aspirational. And I want to have real human characters, whether they're human or not, displaying what it's like to be human and interacting with these wild, crazy, weird things that I throw them into, which is why I hope I never physically run into any of my characters. So in closing, first of all, thank you all for being part of this conversation. Second, take a moment to tell people where they can find you. Of course, all this will be in the show notes and whatnot, but I know that people don't often go back to consult that. So, shout out your website. And if you could have one fantasy object, I didn't prompt you for this because it just came off the top of my head. If you could have one fantasy object in the real world, what would you have?
Oh God, does it have to be from an IP, or can it just be a general object like in D&D, like a bag of holding, or does it have to be like,
it can be,
okay.
It can be something that you made up even.
Okay, this opens up the, okay. Shoot.
I will go first since I sprang this on you guys. Obviously you can find me at scottroche.com. If I could have any one fantasy object, I think it would have to be something like a gem of true seeing, like something that let me sort of cut through the bullshit. Because presumably, since this fantasy object exists, fantasy exists, I would like to have something that lets me see through to the truth of the situation, whether that's through an illusion or whether somebody's lying or not, or things of that nature, because truth is very important to me, and seeing things for what they really are is very important to me. So having something like that would be pretty awesome. Now, Jay, it's your turn.
That's a good one. Wow, that's a good one, Scott. Honestly, I was hoping to go last so I could say a bag of holding. Honestly, a bag of holding. We have to carry so much stuff with us that if I could just have an extra dimensional pocket. Hell, we could use bag of holding to fix the housing crisis. We just have to expand the mouth, but build inside. But it'd be crazy. But Mikel's thinking about it. It could be done. Sorry, Michael.
You good? I was Which version
No,
of my brain was going like, what are the rules?
Honestly, yeah, bag of holding. I go so much through the world just gathering random stuff I have to take with me now. Like, this last 2 years has been nothing but audio equipment and cameras and everything you need to produce television and radio. So if I could just have a bag of holding and take a production studio with me inside of it, that'd be great. Oh my God, I could fit like
Yeah.
a soundboard inside of that thing's. Just be able to take
Just
a
don't-
7. Yeah. Yeah, but
Just,
just
don't put the portable hole inside the bag of holding.
exactly. No, there has to be rules. You have to be rules. So it's a good question that's being asked, like, how does this thing work? But if I had my way, a bag of holding.
And where can we find you?
You can find me at jayrequard.com. You can also find all my books on Amazon and other great booksellers. You can also find all my audiobooks at jaywritesfantasy.bandcamp.com. Yes, I got jaywritesfantasy.bandcamp.com before anyone else did, and it's mine, and I'm actually really proud of it. That's why I share this fact. Thank you, everyone.
Caroline?
If I may, I have to split.
Oh, sure.
So
Okay, go
I'm gonna
ahead.
Let Mick
Go ahead.
find all of our socials, because if you can find him, you can find me. Because
I was gonna
that's
make you
just
do
the
it.
easiest, It's the easiest way to do it. My initial thought when you said fantasy object was Palantir, but then technically I'd probably need 2, so I'm not sure that really counts.
Set.
You might need a set, which might be outside the rules that you said. So I thought back to the beginning. I said the IP that I'm into right now is A Song of Ice and Fire, so I figured the object should be from A Song of Ice and Fire. I would say the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire, because it denotes, right, regalness and royalty, and it's a very, like, who has the sword is important, and it's a symbol of command, but also, right, leads to all these problems. A very complex piece of weaponry, and it'd be really cool to hang house. This has been wonderful. Thank you for having me, and I would love to continue any of these tangential conversations with anybody at a later date. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
We'll go back to Caroline, and then we'll finish up with Michael.
As far as a fantasy object goes, I'm not sure that there's any that I would particularly want. And I mean, I too thought of a bag of holding. But the reality is, if I had one, I would fill it up with a whole bunch of useless crap that I don't even want, because that's what I do with any spare space. It's just sort of collects things that wouldn't be good. And a really cool sword would be awesome, but I kind of collect these. I don't really need fantasy rules to have cool swords. So there are some fantasy people I would like to hang out with. I'd like to hang out with Gwen. She's my main character, and I want to hang out with her. But people like that, so I can kind of do that anyway. So, yeah, I mean, the whole premise of the way I'm approaching fantasy is the reason there's no fantasy magic is because the real world is so magical and so cool. And if we just notice this, so I guess that extends to my philosophy about magical objects too.
It's fair.
I have the cool ones, but how to find me. If you're ever not sure, just use my name. It's the best search term ever for me, because I'm literally the only Caroline Ailanthus in the world. I do have a website. It is carolineailanthus9.wordpress.com. And pretty much any major online bookseller will have my books. Yeah.
It's so tricky because all my favorite fantasy objects and items all come with consequences. So, like, and I think we're all kind of, it's like, oh, I was like, oh, Paragon of Holding. But then my child would crawl into, ooh, Midas hand from Aladdin. Oh, but then my child would touch it. I would be punished no matter what fantasy item I chose. I was like, okay, the magic sword for my book, Galvorn. It would fall off my wall and cut my foot open. Like, I can't choose one that I don't have a consequence for, right? So I'm going to say Galvorn, the magic sword for my books, because I wrote it, so it can't affect me. So canonically, I cannot be harmed by the curse of it because I created it. Which is deeply ironic.
You are God.
The conclusion of the book, but we're going to ignore that. You can find me everywhere on the internet, melwassul.com. We have our own website, Mikel Melwassul on all platforms. You cannot find Dave. He does not exist on the internet. He will not aid me in my quest for social media success. I was going to make him shout out all the social media stuff, and then he left early, and I'm angry at him. But no, yeah, I do all the face stuff. He shows up for podcasts because I make him. But all our stuff is under Mikel Melwassul, same username, every platform, and melwassul.com for signed copies of our books.
Thank you guys so much for coming on, and have a good evening.